going inside the issues of our community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
I think the segregation decision of 1954 probably did more than anything else to awaken the Negro from his apathy to demanding his right to equality.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. The 50th anniversary of the critical Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, is next week on May the 17th. Masterminded on the legal front by Thurgood Marshall, Brown set in motion the ugly and painful death rattle of Jim Crow segregation in Southern schools and fueled the broader civil rights movement. From the safety of 50 years, it is tempting to think Brown settled the issue of segregation in the United States. In fact, for all that Brown accomplished in the states that segregated schools by statute, it left communities that segregated by other means, especially in northern cities like Cincinnati, relatively untouched. The historic and current implications of Brown for Greater Cincinnati is our focus this morning. We begin with the historic reaction to Brown in Cincinnati. I am joined first by Marian Spencer, who throughout the mid-20th century was a major civil rights activist and particularly a leader of the NAACP, and Michael Washington, who's an historian at Northern Kentucky University. Michael's doctoral dissertation is entitled The Black Struggle for Desegregated Quality Education in Cincinnati, 1954 to 1974. Welcome back to Newsmakers in both of your cases. Marian, do you remember in 1954 what your reaction was when you heard of the Brown decision by the Supreme Court? What did you think it meant?
Well, what it meant to me was that my grandfather, who was born a slave in 1854, who had worked to open the public high school in my small town of Gallipolis so that my brother, 5 years older than I, and my twin sister and I could attend, had an opportunity to be vindicated for putting their money behind the legal effort to open the high school to all students in our town. It meant a great deal to me. It had a series of decades of history being vindicated.
So there was a nice 1854 birth date, 1954 decision date.
100 years later, 100 years later.
Did you immediately think that it was going to change the policies about segregation in Cincinnati?
I certainly did. I'm very honest about that. I thought that the law would be followed. And I realized that this was a Supreme Court issued law, and I expected it to be followed without question.
Michael, what was the response of the Cincinnati Board of Education to the Brown decision?
Well, you know, the response was to continue the policies of maintaining educational segregation. Prior to 1954, in fact, in the early part of the 20th century, African Americans had struggled to go to school in the neighborhood. At that time, the school board instituted the policy of separate schools, using Jenny Porter as a way to build separate schools.
Centered down in the old Stowe School in the West End, and that building is still there.
That's
People
right.
can still see it right along I-75. So African Americans wanted to go to neighborhood schools, but the school board insisted they go to segregated schools.
That's right.
Out of their neighborhood. Okay.
And so after 1954, there would be a rigid mandate mandating that students had to go to school in their neighborhood, the neighborhood school policy. And this happened because throughout the early 20th century, by 1930, there was residential segregation had emerged in many northern cities, and especially in Cincinnati. So we had the West End to emerge as a ghetto, concentrating many African American families there. So, of course, by 1954, the perfect solution to maintaining de facto segregation would be to mandate that students go to school in their neighborhood.
You know, in rereading Michael's dissertation a few weeks ago, it struck me that Cincinnati's fascination with neighborhoods in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s maybe had this sort of sinister underlying root in the sense that the school system started talking about the beauty of neighborhood schools as a way of segregating it. And our stress on neighborhoods really might have also had something of a racist twist to it. I just, for the first time, struck me that way.
Oh, I'm sure that was true.
Yeah, Marian, there was a lot of struggle, and you were with the NAACP, very active with the NAACP. How early did you realize that Cincinnati Public Schools was not going to cooperate with the Supreme Court and begin to consider local suits?
Action. J.C. Johnson was president of our local branch, and in '71, we looked at what we thought was not a sufficient movement on the part of the Cincinnati Public School Board. So we filed suit with HEW, Health Education Welfare, to withdraw $600,000 a year plus that they were giving federally to the local schools, because we felt that they were not moving as fast as they should have. And we won that suit. We really won that suit. And it began then to be a struggle as to what were they going to do to change things in the Cincinnati system.
But 1971, we're now talking more than 15 years after Brown.
Brown versus, that's right, Brown versus Board of Education.
So there's a huge lag time here. And you know, Michael, in December of 1973, the so-called liberal board, there was a liberal majority on the Board of Education. In November of 1973, they knew they had lost the election and were going to be voted out. This lame duck group, in December 1973, what did it do?
Well, they made a resolution to desegregate the public schools, such that by the time the schools would open in September, it would be roughly 51% white and 49% black in every school.
And that was the percentage system-wide.
Right,
so
right.
The point was they were taking the percentages that existed system-wide, and they were saying, we were going to desegregate in every school.
Absolutely.
And they're just going to do it.
Absolutely, they were going to do it. They were at the point where they had to do something. They had made incremental changes between, say, 71 and 73, but nothing drastic. And once they recognized that this is the last shot, so on December 10th, 1973, they made that resolution. And of course, as soon as the conservative board came in, they would use Robert Braddock, an African American, of course, to, in a sense, play the role of or keeping the schools in a segregated situation.
So in January 1974, just a month later, right, the new school board rescinds the deseg right suit, and that triggers the famous suit, Mona Bronson versus Cincinnati Board of Education.
Well, we had the deal suit before Mona,
right,
but
that's right,
there was no acceptance of segregation. The schools that were available for black students were non-districted. Douglas, for example, when my husband graduated with a master's in administration and education, he could teach at Stowe or Douglas. Those were the only two schools he could get a job at. The salary was $143 per month, and the rent we paid those years was $43.50. So it was really there were really very few places that people could look for advancment as blacks in the educational system.
Marian, in
two principalships.
That Mona Bronson lawsuit was filed in 1974. In 1972, Donald Waldrop had become superintendent of the schools, and he brought in the concept of magnet schools, right, or alternative schools, SCPA, the Montessori schools, the Paideia schools that have all developed. And this was seen as a way to voluntarily desegregate the schools. How did the NAACP initially look on these alternative magnet schools?
Well, the NAACP was, as other people, dealing with the all deliberate speed concept that was written into Brown versus Board. To some people it meant never. Marshall himself said it meant slow. to me, it meant just what it said, all deliberate speed, but everybody was deliberating but not speeding. And
so you saw this as another delay tactic?
we saw this as, no, we saw it as one of the procedures that might be used to make a difference. And when it was they were put in place, I would like to see, for example, currently all schools to be Montessori. But they will tell you, because they're wonderful schools and children may move at their own individual rates, but they will tell you they're too expensive. Right. Now, I question, what is expense?
Michael, Bronson being filed in 1974, there's another critical Supreme Court decision in 1974, Milliken versus Bradley, that dealt with the Detroit schools, and actually was argued by Nathaniel Jones before he was a federal court justice and was working with the national NAACP. He argued that in front of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, in Milliken case, the request was for a regional desegregation plan, not desegregating just the Detroit schools, but the entire Detroit region, which was the original hope for Bronson.
Right. That was the original plea for Bronson. The NAACP suit filed for a metropolitan solution.
In same year, though, the Supreme Court strikes that down. Was that a critical stepping back from the Brown commitment?
Absolutely, very critical, because once the suburbs no longer have to do anything, then what's going to happen? They're going to concentrate African Americans, minorities in the inner city, keep the neighborhood school policy, and all the white people can go to the suburbs.
But Dan, it was really much more crucial than that for us, because the justice whose vote gave them that decision was from Cincinnati, Potter G. Stewart. And we really felt he should have known better.
And once that decision was clear, didn't you continue to, on the Cincinnati level, you didn't initially just give up on that metropolitan approach. You kept trying to find some way to make it work, right?
Yes, but we would go to the district boundaries and we would see our Cincinnati lawyers on the other side of the case. It made it very, very difficult.
Michael, the Bronson suit was eventually in 1984, filed in 1974, settled in 1984. How was it settled, and how effective would you say the settlement was?
That was a really interesting situation, because it seemed as if even in 1974 you had one person, Robert Braddock, who would be considered a person who would accommodate to the policies of maintaining educational segregation. But by 84, even some of the people who had been liberals believed that this was the best decision. After 10 years, basically, I would say the NAACP had run out of resources to continue to fight. So now we have to do an out-of-court settlement. And the out-of-court settlement resulted in many people who had struggled earlier to resist the attempt to maintain educational de facto segregation. Now there's a kind of a utopian feeling that we're going to achieve segregation through this process of out-of-court agreeing that we're going to do it.
And the out-of-court agreement was for a larger commitment to alternative magnet schools, right, and for what was called the Tauber Index.
Yes.
Marian, we got less than a minute for this segment, but what was the Tauber Index, and what were you trying to accomplish there? Why did the NAACP agree to that?
The NAACP was not in a position to agree to anything else, because at this point it was in the court. Judge Rice from Dayton was in charge, and he felt, we understood that he had less of a chance with a federal solution than dealing with the local one. And the Tauber Index was simply a mathematical way of determining how segregated any individual community was. The figures, they all stand secondary to me to the philosophy. Leadership had to have decided that it was not going for quality integrated education. Otherwise, we would have looked at Marian, we would have looked at Norwood, we would have looked at St. Bernard, we would have looked at Indian Hill. We would have said, let's do this together.
Well, that's a Unfortunately, we have to stop because of time now for the two of you, but that's a wonderful setup for the second part of the show. So we will pick this topic up where you just set it up and be back in just a minute. Stay tuned. After the break, a look at where we stand going forward on the dream of integrated quality education.
It's only been 50 years, but it seems 150.
Segregation, I mean, why would you need it?
Welcome back. For young people who go to integrated schools like the two students you just heard from Holmes High School in Covington, the significance of Brown is obvious. But for many more students, the issues are still very much alive. To discuss where the schools stand today on issues of desegregation, integration, and resegregation, I am joined by Esther Erkins, who teaches in the Department of Education and in liberal arts at the University of Cincinnati, and is the director of the University of Cincinnati Institute on Community Partnerships, which coordinates relationships between the university faculty and staff and the community. Esther, welcome to Newsmakers.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Your doctoral dissertation sort of picked up where Michael Washington's left off, and you pursued the implementation of the decision from Bronson and et cetera. So, and your focus is more on ongoing issues. That's so. Let me, with that as a background, how would you evaluate the level of commitment by local school districts to integration today?
I would say a couple of things about that. I think, on its face, I think districts would say that they are committed to integration goals in schools. That it is an issue that has never left the radar screen for them, but there are particular realities that we're faced with. Always in the North, we have had to deal with issues created by our patterns of residential segregation. And so that created some tremendous challenges in terms of ever even achieving integration, not only in Cincinnati public schools, but in our region at large. So, when we begin to talk about commitment to integration, I guess the question becomes, in the face of our residential realities, it was never an attainable goal.
So that in 1973, as Michael and Marian were just pointing out, in 1973, it was 51%, the Cincinnati public schools were 51% white, 49% white. Today, because of movement out of the city, I think those numbers are closer to 70+%
Right.
black, 25 to 30% white.
Exactly. And what's interesting when you begin to talk about the numbers, racial composition in various school districts in our region, you have districts that kind of run along that Mill Creek corridor, such as Princeton, Winton Woods, Mount Healthy, Cincinnati Public, with black to white student ratios ranging from a little over 50% to over 70% black to white, as opposed to looking at districts such as Oak Hills, Madeira, Loveland, whereas they have between 1% and 1.5% African Americans.
And as you move out into the new suburbs of Westchester and Mason, the same patterns.
Exactly, exactly. So we've been bridled by our residential realities in terms of how citizens live in this region. And for that reason, we've never been able to really grapple with the issue of school integration in the greater Cincinnati region.
Inside of schools that do have some level of a mixed student body, there are also lots of concerns that the students themselves don't interact that well.
Right.
The image of the lunch tables that are segregated.
Right.
What are schools doing to try to address those sorts of issues?
I think that, pretty much with all the other issues that schools are having to grapple with, issues around testing requirements, issues around pay for performance for teachers, other kinds of social issues that schools must grapple with. I think that dealing with issues of integration and how students are intermingling with one another is really kind of one of those issues, that falls really far down the list when we talk about, prioritizing, what are the areas that school administrators need to be concerned with. The other thing that we have to consider is this whole phenomenon of tipping. What tends to happen is once you get a certain percentage of African Americans in a school district is going to rapidly begin to turn over. I mean, we saw that in Cincinnati public schools, whereas when Bronson was filed, you had a 51-49 proportion, and in a 10-year period between the early 70s and the early 80s, you know, Cincinnati public lost almost 30,000 students, and the vast majority were white. You go to districts like Princeton, you start to see the phenomenon of tipping. Mount Healthy, those districts, when you get a certain percentage of African American students, you begin to see a hastening in the departure of white students, white families from the community. There's this whole coded language around the whole issue of, you know, no one will say, well, we don't want our children to attend schools with African American students. It's the whole issue of, well, we want quality schools in our communities. That's what anchors a community.
You know, one of the things that strikes me is that in Cincinnati, I like to say diversity comes in two colors and one language here, as opposed to a Chicago or a New York or a Baltimore, where there's much more complex ethnic mix. In what you have been able to read or see, does it make a difference if there is a district where it's not just black and white is the diversity, but there's other groups that are in there, other language groups, other cultural groups? Does that break down some of this wall? Does that help create real integration?
I think when it comes to African American and Latino students, you see a very similar kind of trend. You look nationally, particularly when you look at the work of Gary Orfield. I mean, he talks about the fact that still in the United States, between 70 and 90% of all African American and Latino students attend schools in racially isolated school districts. So when you're talking about those two groups, you know, we're still seeing that same trend of having an educational experience that's highly segregated. And it's a little less the case for Asian students.
So that as Cincinnati begins to get a few more Hispanics, it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to change in a fundamental sort of way.
Not necessarily.
The question here is 50 years after, and as after Brown, which on its surface tried to end segregated education, and as you and the others have pointed out, for a whole bunch of reasons, we still have a lot of segregation. Does separate still mean unequal?
Well, I would argue yes. I would argue yes, because there's a conventional wisdom that understands that where you have white students, those schools tend to be better resourced in terms of educational inputs. You tend to have more certified teachers, more teachers with master's degrees, greater investment in professional development, greater investment of those kinds of value-added inputs that will enhance students' educational outcomes. I mean, fundamentally, with Brown, the hope was if we can get African-American students access to these same classrooms with white children, then incidentally, they will reap the same benefits. And so that, you know, that way of thinking, it remains with us. I mean, even when you look at our magnet schools here in Cincinnati Public Schools, that's really kind of the only place in the district where you see a level of integration. You know, you compare a North Avondale Montessori to a Rothenberg or a Vine Elementary, whereas you have probably about a 50-50 mix white to African American students in the North Avondale Montessori, and middle class, because there's a class dimension, versus a Rothenberg that is probably like 100% African American, or a Vine that's 100% African American. Poor, you look at the facilities, you look at the teachers that are certified, you look at all the inputs, and they will look very different.
You know, my concern about this, and my children are graduates of Sands Montessori a long time ago, and that certainly was the case. It was 50-50, and they worked very hard to keep it that way, that the level of commitment to those magnet programs, the successful magnet programs, is in decline, serious decline. Do you agree?
When you say the level of commitment
by
from
the school
home,
board?
I wouldn't totally agree with that, because the magnet schools also serve a purpose of providing options to maintain middle class white families in the district.
Yeah.
I mean, there are challenges around how to keep middle class white families, as well as African American families, but particularly white families, you know, sending their children to Cincinnati Public Schools. The magnet schools is really the tool of choice to make that happen. If you got rid of the magnet schools, what would be the thing that would attract middle-class white families? What would allow for them to invest in Cincinnati Public Schools? It would be nothing for them.
Yeah. I want to point something out because Marian asked me to do this and I forgot in the first half. There is a book that people might want to read, Richard Kluger's Simple Justice, which is very good, and also the newest issue of Crisis, the NAACP longtime journal, has focused on the implications of Brown versus Board of Education. So I'd recommend those. Thank you for being with us this morning, and we'll see what happens in the next 50 years with the attempt at segregation and integration. Thank you. Thank you for making Local Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women shaping our community for the future. Have a good week.